Merely an hour ago, Jimmy Butler was traded to the Philadelphia 76ers. At about 1 p.m. on Saturday, November the 10th, Jimmy Butler, along with Justin Patton, was traded to the Sixers for Robert Covington, Dario Saric, Jared Bayless, and a 2022 second round pick. First off, with this trade, we need to look at what the starting lineup is going to be like for the Sixers. They lost two starters in the deal and got one back, so someone from the bench is going to have to come to the starting lineup. I think the obvious starters are going to be Ben Simmons, Jimmy Butler, and Joel Embiid. Those three, of course, are going to be starters. Then you have to look at JJ Redick, Markel Fultz, Wilson Chandler, and Mike Muscala. I think Markel Fultz will probably continue starting considering he has been for the first part of the year. This will probably keep JJ Redick on the bench, which I actually think is a good thing for the Sixers. Now, between Mike Muscala and Wilson Chandler, and even Amir Johnson could get a say in this as well. Who starts at power forward? Assuming Ben Simmons and Fultz are at the 1 and the 2, you have Butler at the 3 and Embiid at the 4. It's Wilson Chandler and Mike Muscala really being decided upon. Wilson Chandler, of course, is a more smaller power forward as a 3 and D player. Mike Muscala is a traditional center, but he can slide to the power forward spot. They're both pretty solid three-point shooters, but I think if I had to decide, I would go towards Wilson Chandler. I think he's just slightly a better player and a slightly better shooter, plus having a more perimeter-oriented player is just better in today's NBA. Now we have to take a look at the Sixers bench, which is going to take a huge hit from this trade. The bench is really not even complete. At this point, there's really only four members that I think are going to be consistently on the bench, them being Landry Shamet, JJ Redick, Mike Muscala, and Amir Johnson. There's really no small forward that they can play. They have Furkan Korkmaz, but he's just not good and would really hurt their bench. What the Sixers may do is what the Wizards do, which is play a starter with the bench unit at times. The starter would probably have to be a wing player, considering that's the position on the bench that the Sixers need. The wing would either be Jimmy Butler, Wilson Chandler, or Ben Simmons. And considering that this player will be playing much more than the other starters, I'd assume it'd be Ben Simmons as he is much more youthful than the other two. And Butler's history of injury is pretty concerning, and I'll get to that actually shortly. Now I'll talk about Butler's fit in Philly, and I'll start with his history of injuries. Butler, of course, was injured last season for just around 20 games, but with him playing nearly 36 minutes year after year, his body is going to slow down sooner than other people. While you see LeBron still going very strong at 34 years old, and other players can still play into their early 30s, Jimmy Butler is going to be someone who I think will slow down at probably 30 or 31 years old, which is relatively early. Adrian Wojnarowski reported that Jimmy Butler and the Sixers fully intend to sign a contract extension this summer. This is pretty concerning for the Sixers, as a max contract would be right around 4 years and $130.35 million. The Sixers right now have tons of financial flexibility, with Joel Embiid being the only player really locked up on a contract extension. The only people on the Sixers that are signed through the 2020 season are Joel Embiid, Markel Fultz, Ben Simmons, Zaire Smith, Landry Shamet, and Jonah Bolden. All of those players except Joel Embiid are on rookie deals and aren't going to be making that much money. When you add Jimmy Butler to the conversation, it gets a little more complicated. Butler would be eligible for a max contract, which would start at just under $30 million in that offseason. Adding $30 million to that crew is going to mean that the Sixers won't be able to sign a big name player in that offseason. That offseason, by the way, is going to feature players such as Klay Thompson, Tobias Harris, and Chris Middleton, all three of which would be great fits on the Philadelphia 76ers. Now I want to talk about the Sixers shooting. They got rid of two of their three best shooters on the team, even if Dario Saric was doing pretty bad this season. Now their best shooter is still JJ Redick, as he is an elite shooter, and the Landry Shamet now becomes their second best shooter. He's been pretty good so far, but it's unclear if he can keep this up for an 82-game season. The next best shooters would probably be Wilson Chandler, Mike Muscala, and Jimmy Butler, all of which are really not good shooters. Chandler's an above average shooter, so is Muscala, and Butler's a average shooter at best, really. Now, while this shooting issue might not be that big of an issue right now, come playoff time, it's going to be a huge issue. If the Sixers get matched up against the Bucks or Celtics with two elite defensive coaches in Brad Stevens and Mike Budenholzer, they're going to have a very hard time getting buckets. In the playoffs, a team's most valuable player can sometimes be a coach. We saw it last playoffs with Brad Stevens, as he was the main reason why the Celtics advanced to the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, going back to the Sixers bench, while having a bad bench right now might not be too big of an issue, come playoff time, it's going to really hurt. After an 82-game season, starters are going to be extremely tired, and the bench is going to be relied upon during the playoffs. If the bench cannot produce, even if they only play like 15 minutes a game, it's going to really hurt a team. We saw last season the Raptors got swept by the Cavs, but the bench was the only reason that some games were close. When the Raptors bench matched up against the Cavs bench, they dominated because the Raptors had probably the best bench in the league, and the Cavs bench just wasn't that good. Come playoff time, you really need a strong bench, and that's just something the Sixers don't have. Now on to the Timberwolves. While at first glance this seems like a horrible trade for the Timberwolves, they traded away a perennial all-star for two role players and a second-round pick, while also getting rid of a young player in the deal in Justin Patton. However, this trade really isn't that bad for the Wolves, and it's actually a pretty good trade. Robert Covington may be one of the more underrated players in the league, as I think people don't really understand his defensive value. Covington, I think, at times can seem a little lost on the court, but at times he's a top 5 defensive player in the league. I think Rudy Gobert, Kawhi Leonard, Draymond Green, and Joel Embiid are really the only players you can definitively say are better at defense than Robert Covington. I think there are other players that are better on defense than him, but I really think those four are the only you can absolutely say with 100% certainty are better than Covington on defense. Covington will do a fine job replacing Butler's defense on the Timberwolves, and Dario Saric should provide some bench scoring, or he could slide into the starting lineup as he's a pretty good fit next to Towns and Wiggins. His three-point shot would help space the floor better than Taj Gibson does right now, which would give Karl Anthony Towns more room to operate down low and Andrew Wiggins more space to drive in the lane. With the Timberwolves, I really only have one issue, and that's who is going to replace the scoring left by Jimmy Butler. Butler is more than capable of putting up 20 a night on good efficiencies, and it's going to be hard to replace that with Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins. If Towns and Wiggins can replace the scoring left by Jimmy Butler, I think this is a pretty good trade for the Timberwolves. The real question now is, are the Wolves still in playoff contention? And again, this really all relies on Towns and Wiggins. If Towns and Wiggins can come out of the gate and are able to score and do it efficiently, I still think the Wolves can be in playoff contention. Now finally, I want to look back at times when a star player was traded, specifically Jimmy Butler and DeMarcus Cousins. When Cousins was traded, it was for Buddy Hield, and that was pretty much it. And people were saying that was an awful trade for the Kings. Look at it now, and it looks like the Kings got the better end of the deal. If you look at the Jimmy Butler trade from a couple years ago, you have Butler being traded for Lauri Markkanen, Zach LaVine, and Chris Dunn. At the time, it seemed like an absolute steal for the Timberwolves, and now it looks like a very bad trade for the Timberwolves. We can also reference the Paul George trade. At the time, looked like an awful trade for the Pacers, and now it looks like a pretty fair trade for both sides. What I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't overreact to a trade like this. While on surface it looks like the Timberwolves got rid of way too much and got back way too little, in a couple years it could be completely different. I think it's too early to really say who won the trade at this point, but I think at the end of the season it'll be a pretty fair trade. I think in the short term it'll look like the Sixers won it, but in the long term it'll look like a very fair trade, if not slightly leaning towards the Timberwolves.